1912 U.S. election, Roosevelt Hoover vs. Wilson Marshall. Theodore Roosevelt wins the election with 317 electoral votes. Easy. Roosevelt would continue the legacy of Republican presidents such as Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley, and William Howard Taft. Theodore Roosevelt, 1 year into his presidency, make William Howard Taft a member of the Supreme Court Justice. Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet, Secretary of State. Maybe someone like Warren G. Harding, Secretary of Defense. Probably someone like Calvin Coolidge or someone like that. Secretary of the Interior. Maybe someone like Robert M. La Follette or Hiram Johnson. More Supreme Court nominees: William Howard Taft and Hiram Johnson and Charles Dawes. World War I. World War I goes well. It stops in 1918 or something like that. 1916 election. McAdoo Smith vs. Coolidge Harding. Calvin Coolidge is the Republican nominee with Warren G. Harding. The Democrats nominated William Gates McAdoo with Al Smith. William Gates McAdoo ends up winning 1916. The violence of 1919. What goes different? The violence of 1919 pretty much stays the same when everything is chaotic across the United States. Not that much to say about his presidency. Election in 1920, McAdoo Smith vs. Hoover Cordes. The Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover, while Hoover nominates Charles Cordes as his running mate. William Gates McAdoo wins again, this time more decisively, with 388 electoral votes. The Roaring Twenties, is it now in full swing? The Roaring Twenties it's now in full swing, when everything seems to become more modern. The Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal does still happen, really holding William Gates McAdoo popularity. Does William Gates McAdoo die in 1923? In real timeline, Warren G. Harding gets a heart attack at the Palace Hotel and dies on August 2nd, 1923. William Gates McAdoo does not die, continuing on his presidency. 1924 election. Smith Roosevelt vs. Hoover Coolidge. Herbert Hoover easily wins 1924. Due to a bad William Gates McAdoo presidency. The Roaring Twenties continue going, and the Teapot Dome scandal continues corrupting the two-party system. 1828 U.S. election, Hoover Coolidge vs. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt becomes the Democratic nominee, and he would nominate John Nance Garner as his running mate. Franklin D. Roosevelt defeats Herbert Hoover with 330 electoral votes. The Great Depression. Does it go well or does it go horribly? The Great Depression isn't really good. Franklin D. Roosevelt has a bad presidential term. As many banks fails, prices continues to go up. Franklin D. Roosevelt lowers tariffs, but raised taxes. Over 20,000 banks fail in the U.S.A. Many troops from World War I is sent back to the United States by Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1932 U.S. election. Hoover Curtis vs. Roosevelt Gardner. Robert Hoover wins re-election in 1932, becoming the first president since Theodore Roosevelt, the third president to win 2 non-consecutive presidential terms. The Great Depression, it ends in 1935, and in 1934 midterms, the Democrats lose the House and Senate. 1936 election, Garner Wilkie vs. Curtis Dawes. Charles Curtis wins 1936. Continuing on, Herbert Hoover's legacy. Not that much to say about Charles Curtis's presidency. He is running for re-election in 1940 against Al Smith and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Charles Curtis wins re-election in 1944. Also, not too much to say about his second term, other that he lowers taxes and lowers tariffs and beef up military spending. World War II starts late. World War II starts in 1943 in this timeline, but it ends in 1946. 1948 U.S. election. Charles G. Dawes vs. Truman Barkley. We don't know who Charles G. Dawes picks as his running mate, but Charles Dawes wins in 1948. An assassination attempt. Does Dawes get one? In real life, Harry Truman gets an assassination attempt in 1951. Charles Dawes does get an assassination attempt, but he survives. The Korean and Cold War. Did it happen? The Korean and Cold War does get worse and very bad. Charles Dawes becomes very unpopular. 1952 U.S. election. Truman Barkley vs. Charles Dawes. Harry Truman easily wins 1952 with 388 electoral votes. Harry Truman would lower taxes and beef up military spending. In 1956, he's running for re-election against Nixon Lodge Jr. 1956 election. Harry Truman wins re-election in 1956. Very decisively, with 338 electoral votes. The Korean and Cold War, does it stop? The Korean and Cold War continues to get much worse, but Harry Truman is still kind of popular for lowering taxes, lowering tariffs, and promising a return to normalcy. 1960 election. Kennedy Stevenson vs. Lodge Jr. Goldwater. John F. Kennedy wins 1960 with 288 electoral votes, much more narrow than in real life. He loses New Mexico and Colorado, unlike in real life, but is able to win Indiana and North Carolina and Virginia, enough to tip him the election. Does he get assassinated in 1963? John F. Kennedy survives his 1963 assassination attempt and continues on his presidency. Meanwhile, Adlai Stevenson, as the vice president to John F. Kennedy, helps John F. Kennedy with his agenda and helps the Senate pass bills. 1964 election. Reagan Goldwater vs. Kennedy Stevenson. It's extremely tough re-election, but John F. Kennedy is re-elected in a miracle with 300 electoral votes. Why was it such a miracle? Due to Reagan's extreme popularity. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War starts in around 1965, a year after John F. Kennedy signs the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But the Vietnam War would stop in late 1967. The Battle of Peace Invasion would also start that year in October, but it would end in December. John F. Kennedy is immensely popular. 1968 election, Reagan Goldwater vs. Stevenson Humphrey. Adlai Stevenson, the vice president, is the 1968 Democratic nominee. Reagan wins 1968 in his own rights. The Vietnam War, does it stop? In real life, Richard Nixon hadn't have his campaign promise to end the war. But Ronald Reagan is able to end the war by 1972. There was no Watergate scandal in 1971. Ronald Reagan is immensely popular. Heading into 1972 U.S. election, Reagan Goldwater vs. Dukakis McGovern. Ronald Reagan easily wins the election. Very easily. Like I said, there was no Watergate scandal. Reagan has a good term. There was no stagflation from 1973 to 1975. 1976 U.S. election. Carter Mondale vs. Ford Dorr. Just like in real life, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale are the Democratic nominees, with Gerald Ford and Bob Dorr as the Republican nominees. Gerald Ford easily wins against Jimmy Carter with 319 electoral votes. The hostage Iran crisis, what goes differently? There was no hostage Iran crisis. And there was also no terrible economy in 1980. 1980 election, Ford Dorr vs. Mondale Florida. Walter Mondale assumed the Democratic nominee, accepting it in 1980. Due to a good presidency, Gerald Ford gets re-elected in 1980. By the way, Gerald Ford would have a bad presidential term. There was a stagflation from 1983 to 1987, and a terrible economy. 1988 U.S. election, Florida Mondale vs. Dorr Robertson. Vice President Bob Dorr assumes the Republican nomination as Gerald Ford's successor, but Geraldine Florida wins the election of 1984. Not that much to say about her presidency. She is running for re-election in 1988 as the first and probably only woman president. 1988 U.S. election, Robertson Buchanan vs. Florida Mondale. Pat Robertson, the failed vice presidential candidate to Bob Dorr, is the Republican nominee. Geraldine Florida wins re-election in 1988. She lowers taxes, lowers tariffs, and beef up military spending, and continues the legacy of Harry Truman. Election of 1992. Clinton Gore vs. Quayle Bush. Bill Clinton wins 1992 with a landslide, following off of a good Geraldine Florida presidency. He would get impeached in 1996 for abuse of power and lying so much under the oath of office. 1996 U.S. election, Clinton Gore vs. Buchanan Bush. Bill Clinton wins re-election in 1996 with a landslide, 388 electoral votes. He gets impeached again in 1999, this time for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But however, the Republicans are doomed in 2000 due to voter fraud in 1999. It looks like it will give the Democrats a boost in the polls in 2000 election. Bush Cheney vs. Gore Kelly. Al Gore wins 2000 easily with 368 electoral votes. The 2004 tsunami devastates the U.S.A. economy, and 9/11 happens on September 11, 2001. COVID happens after 9/11 on December 11th, and it goes all the way until 2007 in this timeline. 2004 U.S. election, Gore Kelly vs. McCain Cheney. Al Gore wins the election with 353 electoral votes, flipping Arkansas and Tennessee. Al Gore has a good term, but there are some mistakes, like the 2006 Hurricane Katrina, which Al Gore isn't able to respond to enough. He also raises taxes by just a bit. 2008 U.S. election, Kelly Lieberman vs. Pence Buchanan. John Kelly easily wins 2008, falling off of a good Gore presidency. Not that much to say about John Kelly's presidency. He is running for re-election in 2012. In 2012, Kelly faces against Dick Cheney, who gets the Republican nominee, but John Kelly wins re-election in 2012. 2016 U.S. election, Clinton Kane vs. Buchanan. We don't know who Buchanan nominates as his running mate, but Hillary Clinton easily wins 2016 with 388 electoral votes due to Buchanan's health and decline. The COVID-19 pandemic, it finally stops in 2020. But however, the Democrats do win the 2018 midterms. 2020 U.S. election, Clinton Kane vs. Bush Kasich. Hillary Clinton wins 2020 re-election in a landslide. 2024 U.S. election, Kane Harris vs. Kasich Rubio. John Kasich easily wins 2024 with 322 electoral votes. Thanks for watching this video. Subscribe.